Hello, I'm Org, and in this video I'm going to review the Messerschmitt Bf-110B, the Tier 4 German heavy fighter. This aircraft is very powerful in its tier, and is almost unchallenged as a high altitude energy fighter down at Tier 4. But before we get into proper review, I'll discuss the history of this aircraft a bit. The Bf-110 was initially supposed to be a Kampfseeroster, a combination bomber and escort fighter for more traditional bombers. To this end, the primary requirement was the range to escort the bombers with some capacity as a fighter and bomber to prove useful over the target. The Fokker 57 from Tier 3 was also designed to the same specification, although that wasn't selected for the Luftwaffe use. The main reason is that Messerschmitt decided to ignore the requirement for an internal bomb bay and instead focused on increasing the speed for the fighter aspect of the role. Luckily for them, the bombing requirement for the design was removed, and the Messerschmitt design was chosen to fill what was now called the Zerstörer role for the Luftwaffe. This aircraft was supposed to operate offensively, while the Bf-109, which was the other German frontline fighter, were to act more defensively. This was because the Bf-109 didn't have the fuel to stay in the air long enough to fight deep into enemy territory. The Bf-110 prototype first flew in 1936, and it was very fast. Definitely faster than the Bf-109B, which was then the frontline Luftwaffe fighter. However, the DB600 engines that were supposed to power it proved problematic, in that there weren't very many of them. So instead, the A and B series of the Bf-110 were powered by the much weaker Jumo variants engines, and they did not have the desired performance. These variants were only produced in small numbers, less than 50 combined. However, in the later half of 1938, the DB601 engine became available, and the Bf-110C variant was developed and entered service very rapidly. The 110C finally had the performance that the initial prototype had, but the 3 years between the prototype and the 110C entering service, and the speed of its rival aircraft had increased dramatically. I mean, that was the time period when they were gut switching from biplane fighters to monoplane fighters, and that would have a significant impact on the 110B, or C as it actually was in history. However, at first the Bf-110 was a stunning success. In the invasion of Poland, the Bf-110 provided the bulk of the Luftwaffe fighter strength. The Bf-109s were mostly retained in Germany to defend against bomber raids, while the 110s were sent deep into Poland to escort the German bombers. While the 110s took some losses, time and time again they were able to devastate Polish fighter formations. This is particularly noticeable in the air battles over Warsaw. The 110s had a distinct advantage because the slower Polish fighters were always climbing to intercept when the Germans arrived, meaning that Germans had both an altitude and a speed advantage and could pick the moment of engagement. The high speed of the Bf-110 compared to the Polish fighters also meant that the Germans could disengage practically at will. In the Norwegian campaign as well, the Bf-110 again proved a success, as the long range of this aircraft meant that transport aircraft and bombers could be escorted on long-range bombing and paratroop missions. As well as this, it proved effective as a ground attack aircraft, destroying a number of British aircraft on the ground, and the fire of the 110s in support of paratroopers were essential in the capture of Oslo. Probably the most important success for the 110, however, was the so-called Battle of the German Bight, a bombing raid of British Wellingtons on the naval base at Wilhelmshaven. Although the bulk of the German defenders were 109s, the firepower of the 110s enabled them to destroy a large number of British bombers. In total, at least half the British bombers were shot down, most of them by 110s, for little result on the Wilhelmshaven. This engagement was one of many which convinced the RAF to focus on nighttime operations in the future. However, come 1940, the Bf-110 started to show its weaknesses. In the early battles in France, Belgium and Holland, the 110s destroyed a number of aircraft, both in the air and on the ground, for comparatively light losses. However, towards the end of the campaign, the situation began to change for the 110. In the west, the 110 started running into more of the British Hurricane and Spitfire fighters. These fighters were comparable in speed to the 110, and so the heavy fighter lost the ability to disengage at will. Even more dangerously, the British fighters were often flying a standing combat air patrol, most famously over Dunkirk covering the evacuation. This meant that they didn't have to climb to engage the 110s. They could essentially, well, they were already at an altitude where they could fight them effectively. 60 Bf-110s were shot down in the later stages of the campaign, which, as far as I can tell, is more than had been shot down in the war up to that point. However, this was only a hint of the losses that were to come in the Battle of Britain. In this battle, the Bf-110s were woefully outclassed. As I said earlier, the enemy fighters, the Spitfires and Hurricanes, were faster. Well, the Spitfire was faster, the Hurricane was roughly the same speed, and both were way more nimble. And with the help of radar, had plenty of time to climb to an altitude to effectively counter the Bf-110s. The battle started in July of 1940, and by August, the Luftwaffe was already struggling to replace the lost Bf-110s. By the end of the battle, 223 had been shot down. At the start of the battle, the Luftwaffe only had 237. When the Bf-110s had an altitude advantage, they could have success, but thanks to radar, this situation was rare during that battle. After that campaign, the Bf-110 was transferred to ground attack duties, where it was quite successful in the Eastern Front, North Africa, the Mediterranean theatre in general. However, by now it was quite obvious that the aircraft simply didn't have the speed or manoeuvrability to be a frontline fighter anymore. This can be seen in game. The Bf-110 relies on speed and altitude to destroy its enemies. In its tier, it has very good altitude performance, speed and climb, meaning this aircraft can climb above everyone else and pick and choose its targets and basically disengage at will. The only aircraft which is really dangerous to a 110B is the 109B, which can challenge it at high altitudes. The 110B is also a very sturdy aircraft and can remain under fire for a long period of time should it be required, and has excellent firepower with two 20mm cannons and four 7.92mm machine guns. Head-on attacks are definitely effective in this aircraft, as you'll usually be able to destroy your opponent in a single pass long before they can do much damage to you. The main weakness of the Bf-110B is its manoeuvrability. Almost every other type of aircraft in this tier can outturn you and outroll you. Essentially running away is really the only effective defensive option you have. Despite this, when played intelligently, the Bf-110B is a very powerful fighter. I won 66% of my 132 battles in this aircraft, with 197 kills and 71 assists, giving me 1.76 kills per game, counting an assist as half a kill. I actually didn't destroy any ground targets in my time in this aircraft, partly because it's difficult to do so from high altitudes, which is where I usually operate this aircraft, and carrying bombs slows it down a lot. I generally limited myself to strafing AA guns in the later stage of the match should it prove useful. I also managed to average 390 experience per game in this aircraft, which is one of my better averages, behind only the Spitfires 1 and 5, the A16-5, the I-16 late, the Bf-110E, and the AO-192, which I still reckon is the most overpowered aircraft in this game. The tactics I use in the Bf-110B are generally quite simple. I climb at the start of the battle. If I'm above all the enemy aircraft, I like to do a split S onto the tail of one of the leading enemy fighters, and either destroy it or disengage into friendly fighters. The enemy tends to give chase, and this causes them to fly into a mass of friendly fighters one at a time. If the enemy aircraft are at my altitude or above, I tend to hang back a bit and wait for these aircraft to dive or turn into a head-on attack with them if it's necessary. If I get into a dogfight without an altitude advantage, I can usually climb and cause a pursuing enemy aircraft to stall, but often it is easier and safer to fly towards friendly fighters and give them a free kill. Once a furball develops, my tactics are simple. I just slash through the battle, doing as much damage as I can on each pass, gain separation and altitude, then, turn back and repeat. I generally target usually the highest enemy first, since they are the biggest threat to a high-speed fighter, but occasionally I'll target, say, a 109B because they could possibly be a threat to me in the future, even if they aren't the highest enemy aircraft. This aircraft is one of the easiest to fly in the endgame. With its speed, you can usually pick the time and place of engagement and disengage if things are not going your way. You also want to break up enemy formations. This is easily done in this aircraft by climbing and running away potentially the enemy team will pursue you, and the ones with low speed and poor climb will be left behind, which allows you to destroy the faster and better climbers one-on-one. When you're in a tier 5 match, however, you lose most of your advantages. Near enough to all the tier 5 fighters are faster than you, and a number have better altitude performance. But in practice, I just tend to fly the aircraft a bit more conservatively in that situation. My aim is simply to do as much damage as I can before I get stuck with a Spitfire or 109E on my tail. But hopefully that doesn't happen, you still get to have a fun game. Oh, and I don't carry bombs on this thing, it's just a waste of a perfectly good fighter plane. Well, that's all I have for this review. I hope you found it interesting or useful, and I'll see you all next time. Just play out this end of this replay, because it's kind of funny. See here, I've got 2 kills, and I'm diving down on a Fokker 57, which you just saw me, I just did the whole go up and force into a stall trick, so now I've come down on its tail. And I always feel sorry for the Fokker 57s, because I'm faster than them, and more manoeuvrable than them, and have better firepower than them, and a better altitude performance than them, and the only advantage they've got is they've got more hit points, but that just delays the inevitable. But you can see it's putting up a bit of a fight, but I still get my 3rd kill. And there's only 3 enemy aircraft left, and 2 of them are down there fighting 2 of our fighters. And well, I got my assist on another Fokker 57, so there's only 1 Fokker 57 left down there and a BSH-2 over by our base somewhere. And I'm boosting to try and get over there to help out my team. But it turns out they don't need my help. And there's just the BSH-2 left, and it's over in our base, well, near our base. So I'm using my boost again to get over there. I actually probably shouldn't be climbing right now, because I know it's at fairly low altitude since it's strafing the ground targets, but it's kind of just a habit of mine. Even when I'm not really trying to climb, I always climb a little bit, just in case. And where is that ground attack aircraft? If you want to, flying upside down actually really helps with spotting them, since you can see, I think it's almost twice as far up as you can down. But it doesn't matter, I spot it there. And it should be fairly straightforward here. I've got plenty of health, and it doesn't. I'll try and pull up, but it's a bit late. Unfortunately, this game ends in a draw.